I've said many times, because I've spoken anywhere and everywhere, I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of lawyers and hundreds and thousands of adults, different countries, especially in the States and different Canada, that with regards to Omar Khadr, I've never met anybody who has been so abused and so abandoned by so many people who should know better. And I wish to, before I even move into my talk, and Bill had mentioned I'd received this pro bono award by all the law councils of Canada. So I received this award before 200 lawyers. And I started off by telling them that I'm Scottish, and there's not such a word in the Scottish dictionary called pro bono. It's a little bit of a joke, but it's true. But I also recall, when I finished my talk, I received a standing ovation from every one of those lawyers in the room, 200 plus of them. But I also do recall the next day I received not one single email or one single call from any other lawyer. And so I have been journeying in every court of the land you could find, and I have been looking, and I have realized along the way that politics trumps law, and if I need to be successful, I need to also become a professional lecturer on the circuit. So with those words, I'll move into Omar Khadr. In 2004, I appeared in the United States Supreme Court advocating for the habeas rights of a client I'd never met, because at that point in time, the United States was not permitting me into Guantánamo Bay, or anybody else for that matter. And I remember when I left the court that day, I, along with other lawyers, left in a sort of self-congratulatory mood, thinking of a job well done. We had done well that day. I believed, and they believed, that Omar Khadr would now be able to challenge his unlawful detention in a properly constituted federal court system and provided with all the necessary protections under both international and domestic law. In fact, we even drank champagne in anticipation of a judgment that would later come down in our favor. And along the way, I appeared in various other courts, including the Canadian Supreme Court on behalf of Omar Khadr on 2 separate occasions, each time obtaining a successful ruling. And Omar was a young boy during that period. He is now 27 years of age, as Bill stated, and he is still incarcerated in a prison. Only this time, it's a Canadian prison. And earlier this month, actually it was last month, we filed an appeal of Omar's convictions before a US military commission review panel, as we re-engage the US justice system once again on a road that will assuredly lead us back to the US Supreme Court, as we seek to right many of the injustices Omar Khadr has suffered. And also last October, I re-engaged the Canadian legal system by filing a habeas brief challenging Omar's detention in a Canadian prison since his return from Guantánamo. And this challenge will be heard next month by the Court of Appeal. I also have an ongoing litigation lawsuit against the Canadian government. I've had it for many years. I have used it. It was a civil lawsuit I started from the very outset, and I used it to get disclosure. It's interesting in this day and age that you can get more disclosure in a civil lawsuit seeking money than you can in a criminal proceeding when you're trying to fight for someone's innocence. And I'm relying, as the years have progressed, in part on a ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada in Khadr 1 that held that the US had violated the Geneva Conventions and the International Convention on Torture in its dealings with Omar Khadr, and that Canada had been complicit in that conduct. So as I stepped back into the United States to appear before a military commission review panel, whose responsibility is to ensure that the finding of guilt and the sentence imposed on Omar Khadr by the military commission court in Guantánamo Bay is both correct in fact and in law. But having said that, don't confuse a military commission review panel as a real appeal court. It is simply a political creation. It is intended to provide legitimacy to the military commission tainted trial process. The military commission itself was set up in a remote part of Cuba for a purpose, namely, to avoid oversight, to avoid scrutiny. No public gets to witness its proceedings, or anyone else for that matter, but the very few. Its legal status has been impugned internationally by governments, by jurists, by human rights organizations, everywhere, as being nothing more than a kangaroo court whose legal process is designed to ensure a finding of guilt. Any American citizen charged with terrorism or terrorism-related offenses is not tried by a military commission court in Guantánamo Bay. He is tried in a properly constituted federal court system on mainland USA and provided with all the necessary procedural protections to ensure that his due process rights are protected. So what does that say? It says the military commission process is not good enough for an American, but it's good enough for a 15-year-old Canadian Muslim youth. No white guys go to Guantánamo. We only send Muslims there, with the exception of David Hicks, I guess. The military commission panel, appeal panel, is no different. It is set up to provide cover for the tainted military commission process. The only difference between both courts is that one is situated in Washington and the other is situated in Guantánamo. It is still a kangaroo court by another name. I have no confidence that the Military Commission Appeal Panel will carry out its responsibility to conduct a fair and proper oversight of Omar's convictions, both in law and in fact. I fully expect it will dismiss the appeal outright, requiring us to seek relief in the US federal court system. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking for Omar as he continues to languish in jail. Now, Morris Davis, a horrible man in my view, and former chief prosecutor for the Military Commission trials in Guantánamo Bay, has lately become a new man. He has come to criticize the Military Commission process that he played a big part in. In a recent interview, he stated that the running joke in Gitmo amongst the lawyers there was, in order to win in Gitmo, you have to lose. You know, you have to go to court and lose and be convicted as a war criminal, and you know, you might get to go home. I'm astounded with that comment. Why? Because it's right on the money. It's prophetic. The choice put to Omar in Guantánamo Bay in the course of a trial was, if you persist in this trial and are successful, you may continue to be indefinitely detained for the remainder of your life. Or you could plead guilty to the offenses and the facts that we have fictionalized, and we will give you an 8-year sentence. And you can leave Guantánamo after 1 more year to serve out the remaining of those years in Canada under Canadian law. And who amongst us would not have taken this plea deal to escape the hellhole of Guantánamo, to escape the waterboarders, the torturers, and the solitariness of years in concrete windowless cells? However, I found it most difficult to persuade Omar Khadr to accept that plea deal. I breached every ethic that I stood for as a lawyer. He was taking that deal one way or the other. And I recall what he said to me. He said, if I take this deal, Canadians will think I'm a terrorist. And I said, when we get you to Canada, we'll get you out and you'll be able to show the world exactly who you are. So I'm still trying to get him out so he can show the world who he is. So in drafting an appeal, any appeal, an appeal court requires a brief statement of facts in order to bring context to the legal issues being challenged. In Omar's case, for me, it was a journey of going back in time, when Guantánamo was a much darker place. And when I finished that journey, I was reminded that the only evidence against Omar Khadr are his own self-admissions made under duress and torture. There are simply no witnesses to the allegation that Omar threw a hand grenade that killed a US Special Forces Delta guy, Christopher Spear. No forensic evidence was preserved to prove that Sergeant Spear was even killed by a hand grenade. The lack of forensic evidence itself prevented Omar Khadr advancing the defense that Sergeant Spear was killed by friendly fire, namely a hand grenade thrown by a US soldier in the chaos of battle. So as I take you through this legal journey, I would ask you to judge Omar's case from the perspective and the standard of justice each and every one of us would expect if it was our child in a court of law, facing the same charges. On the morning of July 27, 2002, a group of approximately 55 heavily outfitted US soldiers and Afghan militia members departed from a forward operating post near Khost, Afghanistan, in a convoy of pickup trucks and armoured Humvees. Their objective was to capture or kill a suspected al-Qaeda bomb maker in a nearby village called Ayub Kale. And although they did not find that intended target, they were directed to a mud brick compound where a small group of suspected militants were living. The US forces surrounded the compound and they triggered a fierce siege that lasted several hours. Thousands of rounds of ammunition and dozens of grenades were used in the siege. The on-scene commander, then Major Stephen Watt, called in close air support, which included multiple strikes of cannon and rocket fire by fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. In fact, the military notes described that the pounding to the compound was relentless, with many sections of exterior walls collapsing, resulting in a fire starting inside one of the buildings in the compound. The air assault included 2 bombing runs by F-18 Hornets, each of which dropped 500-pound bombs on the compound, which caused, of course, significant destruction. The shelling was so intense that the US forces' written reports believed that there was no way that anyone could have survived. although they operated on the assumption that some hostile forces may be alive and could be expected on site. So Major Watts sent in a final assault element, including Delta Force Officer Christopher Spear. And their job was to clear out any remaining pieces of buildings that were still standing and look through the rubble. And as they entered the compound, some of the soldiers threw grenades into the compound to counter any remaining threat. Subsequently, unfortunately and sadly, Sergeant Spear was mortally wounded by an exploding grenade. In the meantime, stunned by the concussive force of the bombing, Omar Khadr had sustained multiple wounds to the head and body, including blinding shrapnel wounds to his eyes. And while blind and suffering from these injuries, and sitting on the ground with his back to the action, he is alleged to have tossed a grenade over his soldiers, clearing an 8-foot interior wall behind him, sailing as far as 80 feet in the direction of the advancing soldiers. And it's this grenade that he is alleged to have killed Delta Force Officer Christopher Spear. I suggest to you the act itself is most improbable, considering that an injured person with his injuries, sitting on the ground with his back to an 8-foot wall, was able to throw a hand grenade over that wall, and it continued for a further 80 feet. If you don't believe me, try it. And of the hundreds, unfortunately, the hundreds of US soldiers killed in Afghanistan, Christopher Spear was the only one whose combat death was charged as a war crime, and that allegedly against a 15-year-old boy. I remember one time in Guantánamo. Staying in Guantánamo was a horrible time. 2 days a week is like a lifetime. And I remember one time being engaged by this prosecutor who asked me how my boy was doing. And I was particularly edgy, being Scottish. And I challenged him. I said, surely when I look around here at all these cages, there's got to be somebody more serious of an Al-Qaeda warrior than a 15-year-old kid stuck in here. He just laughed at me. So I never ever understood why Omar Khadr was singled out. And so what happened then was a Delta Force officer called OC1, whom I've met, spoken with, quite liked, then shot Omar Khadr twice in the back, which left 2 gaping exit wounds in his chest. And we've had 2 forensic psychologists determine that the 2 exit wounds could only have been made if Omar was lying in a prone position when shot. And given the caliber of type of gun and the nature of the ammunition, this could only mean that Omar was shot point blank while lying face down in the dirt. In fact, we have photographs of him lying face down in the dirt along with other bodies. And that is also a war crime. As under the law of war, you may not kill a wounded enemy who is no longer in the fight. But Guantánamo prosecutors held that Omar must have thrown the hand grenade, as everyone else in the compound was dead. So it just made sense. He was the last man standing. He threw the hand grenade. And so he was then tortured into confessing he had thrown the hand grenade against Christopher Spear. The importance of Omar's confession would become clear 2 years later, with disclosure that contrary to the government's initial account, A second man was found alive in the compound by the first commando to enter the compound. And that commando shot him dead before shooting Omar Khadr. Now, you can't make these stories up, because I could tell you how we discovered that. Having failed in, I don't know, maybe 45 pre-trial motions in Guantánamo Bay, and then we're in trial, the press were provided with what was supposed to be the original report prepared by Major Watt, that attested to the fact that Omar Khadr was the last man standing, or the last man lying on the ground and alive in Guantánamo Bay. And some sergeant in passing these documents out to the press, what do we get? We get the original document, which talked about another Taliban warrior who had been shooting non-stop, been fighting, and was killed by OC-1. When Major Watt was questioned on that, what he said was, well, you know, I was asked to review my notes, and I recalled, and this is years later, that I'd done it wrong. He had a better memory years later than he had the day after the initial firefight. The entire case against Omar was based on admissions that he had made in the Bagram hospital and later in Guantánamo during the first 3 years. Without that, there's no case. These statements were obtained through a series of coercive, uncounseled, and abusive interrogations that began as soon as he regained consciousness in the Bagram hospital, approximately 1 week later. Omar himself has absolutely no memory of what happened that day. And that is not surprising, considering the trauma that he experienced. Sedated and lying wounded on a hospital bed in a hospital, interrogators' notes indicate he appeared frightened, he was weak and disoriented from pain and fatigue. And it's in this condition Khadr was told by his captors that he had killed a US soldier with a grenade. And then the government, the US government, then systematically manipulated an injured and vulnerable minor to adopt the preconceived story. Throughout his detention, Khadr was relentlessly questioned by intelligence officers and law enforcement agents at Bagram and Guantánamo on hundreds of occasions. I've done a number of terrorist trials, probably one of the few people you ever meet who's done many of them. I've been at a secret prison in Pakistan. I did the Toronto 18 of young men who were going to blow up buildings in downtown Toronto, and so on and so forth. I've done Abdullah Khadr, Omar Khadr. I even helped an IRA guy one time, many years ago. And the one thing that always shocks me, I used to get puzzled by how many times you have to be interrogated before you accept what's been told to you. And in Guantánamo breaks the record. Guantánamo, you're questioned every day for years. And then they stop and they come back and question you. In fact, even after Omar Khadr's, after we did the deal in Guantánamo, and I came back to Guantánamo, Omar Khadr had been receiving interrogation sessions with the FBI, 9 hours a day, 3 weeks at a time, with different groups. And the point of all that is, I get you to give me one answer, and I make sure, and once I get the right answer out of you, I make sure you believe it. I keep asking you, and you keep telling me, I keep telling you what you want to hear, and then I believe what you say you believe. And during these question sessions, he was never advised that he was the target of an ongoing criminal investigation, much less that he had a right against compelled self-incrimination. He was also held incommunicado, without advice of counsel, access to consular officials, family contacts, or a guardian. It was years before he actually met a lawyer. And there's no evidence to what type of hand grenade killed Speer. The only evidence they had at trial was a piece of shrapnel that they took from the body of a soldier who had survived 6 years later. And they said, well, this must be the same shrapnel that killed Speer. And that was the quality of the evidence they had. No eyewitnesses saw Omar fire a weapon or otherwise engage in hostilities against US forces. But let's not forget the conditions of his detention, which were, to say the least, highly abusive, both psychologically and physically. Khadr's principal interrogator was Sergeant Joshua Claus, who questioned him 20 to 25 times over a 3-month period for up to 6 hours at a time, often while pain medication was withdrawn and he was being sleep deprived. In fact, if I recall, the Israeli Supreme Court talks about sleep deprivation as one of the most effective torture tools. And prosecutors granted immunity to Claus after he was convicted of beating another detainee to death, so he could testify against Omar Khadr. And Khadr was subject to serious physical mistreatment. At the outset, he was initially unable to walk due to the seriousness of his injuries, so as a result, he was taken into the interrogation room with his hands and feet shackled to a stretcher. Pain medications were withdrawn before the interrogation and later after the interrogation. When Claus did not like the answers he was given, he forced Omar to sit up on the stretcher, which caused agonizing pain, reducing this 15-year-old boy into tears and screams. Every descriptor I give you, they have a word for it in Guantánamo. They don't call it torture, they have a name. And his captors shined bright lights directly into his damaged eyes to cause him further pain. On various occasions, he was placed in an interrogation room with a hood over his head to disorient him. Barking dogs were then brought into the room to terrify him. And remember, he's 15 years of age at the time. And the fear in him was exacerbated by the fact that the hood was wrapped tightly around him, choking him, making it hard to breathe. And he was also subject to the sleep deprivation technique known as the frequent flyer program. Damien Casseri, whom I'll mention later on, a torturer who worked under Claus, said, but it really works. You don't give them any sleep, it really works. They walk around the room talking to themselves and they're trying to walk through the walls. And Claus himself admitted that he used these crude interrogation methods more often with Khadr than with any other detainee. And a variety of other factors were used to deepen Omar's sense of isolation, his vulnerability, and dependence on his captors. For example, in the hospital in Bagram, he was able to hear the screams of both guards and detainees coming from the interrogation rooms. I remember when it hit me. I remember when I was I'd listened to Omar, I had done some inquiries, and then I got hold of certain documents, and it hit me that every bed in that hospital was a torture center. And Omar describes the pains the cries of pain that he heard for pains from injuries that these detainees had, and also pains from torture. And in that hospital, Omar was befriended by an older Muslim man who had bandages on his legs as a result of the abuses he was enduring. And he and Omar became close. He was befriended by this old man. And on one occasion, he was able to hear screams of both guards and this old man come from the nearby interrogation room. And later, the interrogator informed him that the old man had died from his injuries. And this graphically illustrated to Omar that his death in US custody was a realistic possibility. In fact, in speaking to some former Guantánamo detainees, British Guantánamo detainees, the one thing that stuck out, some of them saw Omar when he was in Bagram. What stuck out was one of them said to me, you know, when Omar was in Bagram, he would join us in our prayers. And he had the most beautiful of voices. And yet I've asked Omar to sing many times, just him and I. And he's never sung since then. And before the gunshot wounds to his back and his chest had healed, Omar Khadr's hands were chained above his head to the door frame or ceiling in these interrogation rooms, where he was forced to stand for hours at a time in a crucifixion pose standing on his toes. And when he needed to urinate and started urinating, he would be taken down and his head would be used as a mop. And we couldn't persuade Judge Brownback to accept that as admissible evidence at the trial. And we had a former army medic who was prepared to testify that he once found Khadr chained to the door frame of a 5-foot square wire cage, with his arms suspended above his shoulders, hooded and weeping. And we have a photograph of not of Omar, of another detainee in that position. And Omar would also be singled out for the night shift. And the night shift is when he was able to get out of bed and able to walk with all the tubes in his body. He was required to walk up and down the hallway all night with buckets of water, heavy buckets of water, up and down, up and down. In fact, the nurse's notes indicate that his wounds were weeping at that time. And of course, there's no question that Omar's mental health suffered as a result of the abusive conditions to which he was subjected to. In fact, his own interrogators, those cruel and inhuman individuals, worried about his deterioration, noting that he cried frequently, appeared suicidal and depressed, and was in apparent need of psychological assistance. And I say to you, it goes against the very core of humanity that torture and abuse of anyone, let alone a 15-year-old boy, would take place in a hospital where people are at their most vulnerable. Now, when I talked about Claus, and I mentioned Damien Cassetti, you actually know who those guys are. If you watch TV and you saw those pictures of US soldiers in Iraq, in Abu Ghraib, with one girl smoking with a hand standing on Muslim bodies piled on top of each other. That was Claus's group. When we talk about working hard and being promoted, they worked really hard. They did so well in Bagram that they got promoted to Guantánamo, and then did so well in Guantánamo they were promoted to go to Abu Ghraib, where they ran the prison and did such wonderful things as they have done. And I've spent a lot of time with Damien Cassetti. Damien Cassetti has reached out to me a number of times over the years, wishing to meet Omar. And I'm in a documentary with Damien Cassetti. And Damien Cassetti, if you're with him, he feels like his skin is coming off. He talks to you like every part of his skin's coming off. And he tells us on this video, this documentary, you know, we did terrible things to that boy. I'm saying that to you. Why is your country not doing something? And he'll show his shirt, he'll unbutton his shirt, he's got a big tattoo that says, I'm a monster. He knows he's been a monster, and he can't live with himself. Whereas dear old Claus, he and I engaged words in Guantánamo at the trial. He turned up dressed all in black. He's no longer in the military. He's treated like a hero. And if I didn't believe in peace, I may have thumped him when I met him. He was arrogant, despised me, despised everything. And he was fawned over by all the soldiers. He was their hero. And yet I remind myself of my first meeting with Omar in Guantánamo Bay many years ago, in conditions that continue to haunt me, or at least conditions that haunt me less, but drive me on. In Guantánamo, there are the cages, but then there are the secret prisons, 3 of them, in the desert. They're cold concrete buildings, all kinds of barbed wire. Excuse me. And when I recall walking into this, I'd arrived in Guantánamo for the first time. And I felt really cocky. You know, I'm a lawyer and I'm getting to Guantánamo. Truly, my ego was running crazy. And I arrived there as a lawyer. So it's another big case on the resume. And then I get into this, drive in Guantánamo Bay, and I get into this boat that's taking me somewhere else. And I'm going to the secret part of Guantánamo Bay. And then I see all these cages. But I don't stop there. I go to a secret prison. And I was intimidated by the solitariness of it, the quietness of it, the gloom inside. And I walked into this cell. And here was this young boy sitting on a bed, chained to the floor, handcuffed and shivering. And the cells, like many of those cells in those prisons, were kept cold to keep the detainees uncomfortable all day. And he was paralyzed on one side. He was blind in one eye. He had so much damage about him, and he looked pale and ill. And I remember gasping because it sort of reminded me of a little broken bird. And so as I walked in there as a lawyer, I came out of there as a very sad father. And I tried to engage him in a conversation, and I had just been told before I even got into the cell that Omar had not spoken to anybody for months. He had just withdrawn into himself. And so I spoke to him. I spoke at him. I was there for 3 days, and the first 2 days, not a word. And I thought, I can't represent this guy. He's not instructing me. He's completely withdrawn. And finally, just to pass time, I took out my wallet, and I started going through my wallet and showing him my credit cards, and I pulled out some little hockey cards I have of my youngest boy, Duncan, where he's dressed in his hockey outfit at different ages and playing hockey, and it tells you what his weight is and what the name of the team. And I passed it to Omar, and Omar started to feel it, then look at it. And at some point, he then engaged me in conversation. And I remember what he said to me when I was leaving that cell. He said, "You leave me, everybody does." And throughout all this, Prime Minister Harper and his representatives, whom I call lackeys, persisted in telling persisted in telling the Canadian public that they had been assured Omar is being treated humanely, and that they, the Canadian government, would take the United States at its word, even though other Western countries, including your own, were less accepting of US assurances. They demanded and were granted the return of their detainees, adults, each and every one of them, while this young Canadian boy, citizen, was simply abandoned in hell. And that's fascinating because Canada is also one of the drafters and first signatories of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In fact, one of the drafters is a guy called Humphreys, a Canadian, whom I was just recently given a Human Rights Award by an organisation that commemorates him. And what was fascinating about the Human Rights Award was the next day I was in court in Canada, which is only, I don't know, a couple of months ago. And the Prime Minister held his own personal press conference an hour before I was going into court to tell the Canadian public what a bad person Omar Khadr was, that he'd been provided with due process, that he had killed terrorists. He was a terrorist and he killed people. Never in my experience have I ever had that experience. A government, certainly a Western government that promotes the law, due process and justice, to speak out about someone who's going to court. Our government, the Canadian government, by its actions over the years has demonstrated a shocking, a reckless and ruthless disregard for those moral and legal laws that gives effect to the ideal of fairness. This government is changing the face of Canada, the nature of Canada. And by doing so, it is shown how fragile are the laws and their application that we all assume protect us when faced with a government determined to follow a contrary path. Our generation has had the most sophisticated development of international laws, treaties and conventions the international community has ever known, all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. These international instruments include the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so on, all applicable to Omar Khadr and other detainees in Guantánamo Bay and elsewhere, and all denied to them. In fact, I often describe international human rights law as all pretty, all dressed up, but nowhere to go. And as a signatory to these international treaties, Canada has an obligation to protest when they are not being applied to one of its citizens. And yet, it has continued to pick and choose when to uphold its obligation under international law. For example, the Canadian government interceded with the Mexican government to release Brenda Martin, found guilty of fraud by a properly constituted Mexican court of law. There was a chap from Edmonton who was a real shyster. He did all kinds of fraud and Brenda worked for him. And when things got too hot in Canada, he goes down to Mexico. And he takes Brenda and the rest of his friends down there. And Brenda is found guilty by a Mexican court of law. Canada interceded on behalf of Brenda Martin. It even sent a private jet to bring her home to Canada. Whereas it was only after years of urging by the US and others did our government agree to allow Omar to return to Canada, but only if the American government would fly him home. He was supposed to be released within a year after the plea deal, and Canada refused to take him home, even though they'd signed this plea deal. participate in the plea deal. It took the pressure of the Americans and an extra year later before he was allowed to come back to Canada, but only by allowing the Americans to fly him in. This government didn't want to be seen to do anything for him. And I suggest, quite obviously, there can't be two levels of justice and treatment for Canadian citizens. The treatment of Brendan Martin compared to Omar Khadr, a Muslim, a youth. So I say to you, these are hard times. In fact, I say to you that my legal journey has been a sober reminder about the very limits of justice itself. We are witnesses to habeas corpus being abandoned, secret courts being created to hear secret evidence. I work in those courts. Guilt inferred by association, torture and rendition nakedly justified, and vital international conventions consolidated in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Geneva Conventions, the Refugee Convention, the Torture Convention, and more have been deliberately avoided or ignored in the war on terror by Western governments, including my own. And I would never have envisaged that the history of the new century would encompass the destruction and distortion of fundamental legal and constitutional principles that have been in place since the 17th century. We appear to have forgotten the lesson of the Star Chamber, where the accused were submitted to torture, to accusations based on secret evidence, heard by a secret court while being shackled and in extremes of isolation. The worst excesses of the past year should have sounded loud alarms, not the least because of that precise historic parallel to the Star Chamber. One has to look no further than Guantánamo Bay, where individuals have been arbitrarily detained for years without being charged, without access to courts to challenge the detention, where there is no civilian oversight to the numerous credible allegations of torture and abuse. And all those descriptors should come as no surprise to anyone, because it was in January of 2002 that we all saw the first shocking images of human beings in rows, in aircraft, hooded and shackled for transportation across the Atlantic, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years earlier. We are all witnesses to the captors humiliating these enormous human beings, unloaded at Guantánamo Bay, crouched in open cages in orange jumpsuits, all deliberately displayed for the world to see. Amongst them, Omar Khadr. For you and I in the watching world, no knowledge of international humanitarian conventions was needed to understand that what was being witnessed was unlawful. This was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was far worse. Far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of the law, and intended to remain so, as it does till today. In that world, crimes against inhumanity would be carried out in Guantánamo Bay. So, as I wind down, Guantánamo Bay is an affront to the rule of law. Yet throughout it all, I have never wavered, despite the innumerable legal challenges placed before me by hostile governments more interested in covering up their egregious misconduct than being committed to transparency and openness. It is my simple belief that the right to justice is a universal entitlement of every human being, irrespective of nationality or citizenship. I've always viewed law as a great equalizer, whether to promote justice and individual liberty or as a restraint upon the exercise of power. and I continue to view law not as an enemy of liberty, but its partner. I remind you what the political philosopher Edmund Burke once described civil society as a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. It is this commitment to the rule of law that has allowed me to keep my promise to Omar not to walk away. Notwithstanding, there have been many times when I've been exhausted by the journey or ashamed at the extent to which I have put my family's financial security at risk. When you're talking pro bono, you're looking at it. Or that I have missed both my sons' graduations, or other family matters. Yet my wife, Patricia, and my sons, Cameron and Duncan, have stood alongside me throughout. Simply because, it's as simple as this, it's the right thing to do. It is not naive to believe we can affect change. Real change through cooperation, through advocacy, through the ballot box. But it is naive to think we can sit back and get it. Our rights are being infringed more and more on every side, and the danger is we get used to it. It's normal. The story of Omar Khadr is not just about a young boy who was detained and abused. His story is about how we as individuals define ourselves as a society, as individuals, and what we are prepared to stand up for. So as I conclude, embedded in my talk today has been the responsibility, the imperative to stand against injustice. I don't think it was a fancy word. I think it's a real word. Our responsibility as human beings is to speak out to the reality of inhumanity and to speak out against the moral hollowness of political inaction. The only crime equal, in my view, to willful inhumanity is the crime of indifference, the crime of silence and forgetting. Thank you very much.